May 8th, 19425. Haudegen Station, Svalbard archipelago, the top of the world, where the sun circles without setting and the wind never stops. The radio room was silent, except for the hum of the generator and the faint hiss of static. The men had taken off their gloves, their fingers raw from cold, but no one wanted to leave. They were waiting for a voice, a code, a word from a homeland that had not spoken in weeks. The receiver crackled again. Nothing, only the empty rhythm of the Arctic. Sergeant Muller adjusted the frequency knob for the 100th time, his breath fogging in the air. "Still no Berlin?" he asked quietly. Dr. Wilhelm Dege, the leader of the small weather team, stood beside him. He was not a soldier by nature, but a scientist, a geographer turned officer sent north to record the movement of air and ice for a war that now felt impossibly far away. His eyes, pale as the snow outside, stayed fixed on the radio. "No Berlin," he answered, "but we continue the report." At precisely 1600 hours, as they had done every day for months, Muller tapped out the weather transmission. Temperature -12 degrees. Wind 8 knots north-northwest. Visibility moderate. All stations operational. The message went into the void. No acknowledgement. No code reply. No sound, but the slow beating of the wind against the walls. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Corporal Schreiber, the youngest of them, tried to smile. "Maybe the storm has broken the signal," he said. "Tomorrow will be better." Dege nodded, though he knew that something larger had broken. He had seen the signs in the last reports before the silence: retreat, defeat, cities falling like dominoes on a map. Yet here, in the white stillness of Svalbard, there was no war and no peace, only duty. He wrote the date carefully in his logbook, May 8th, 1945. He did not yet know that on this very day, thousands of miles to the south, Germany had signed its unconditional surrender. Dege closed the book, his pencil trembling slightly in his gloved hand. He looked around at his men, 11 faces pale in the half-light, tired but steady. They had lived here for 8 months, isolated at the edge of the earth, sending weather data for U-boats that would never return, for commanders who would never read their reports. They did not know that their empire had fallen, that their flag had lost its meaning. Dege turned toward the camera-like eye of the radio, a black mouth that had swallowed every message they sent. "If the world has ended," he murmured to no one in particular, "we will be the last to know." He signaled for Muller to power down the transmitter. The faint click echoed through the concrete hut like a clock striking midnight. Outside, the wind swept across the ice fields, carrying no sound but its own endless voice. The sky was an unnatural blue, the kind that only exists in places too far north for comfort. Dege stepped outside for a moment, squinting against the light. The snow glittered like shards of glass. Far off, the antenna masts stood rigid, pointing toward a sky that no longer answered. He thought of his wife in Germany, his son, the university in Bonn, where he once taught geography before the war swallowed everything. He wondered if any of it still existed. He turned back to the station, his boots sinking into the snow, the door shut behind him with a dull thud. In that moment, somewhere over Europe, church bells were ringing, crowds were cheering, and the world was announcing the end of a war that had burned for 6 years. But on Svalbard, the men of Haudegen stood in silence, unaware that they were now the last soldiers of a vanished nation, still recording wind speeds and temperatures for a command that no longer existed. And you, watching this story unfold, imagine being there, the only human voices for 1,000 miles, the war over but no one to tell you. What would you do? Would you keep following orders, or would you let the silence answer for you? Tell me in the comments below what you would have done, and if you want to follow the forgotten stories of the war, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Dege looked at the frozen horizon once more and whispered, "Continue the report tomorrow." The generator coughed, the static returned, and the Arctic swallowed their signal again. Keeping the pencil line straight in his log, Dege could almost hear the earlier echo of footsteps in a different corridor, a different season. Before the silence, before the Arctic swallowed their names. 1 year earlier, in September 1944, the air had smelled of dust and ink rather than ice and diesel, and the only white on the horizon had been the glare of paper on a long conference table. Berlin, the military weather service. A guard checked Dege's papers twice, then led him through a narrow hallway where photographs of cloud formations hung like portraits of distant rulers. In a room without windows, 3 officers and 2 scientists studied a map of the North Atlantic spread across the table, its blue surface marked with red pencil tracks like the scars of a sea creature no one had seen. A brass clock ticked with the stern rhythm of orders. "Dr. Dege," the senior officer began, his voice restrained, "we require an operational weather station in Svalbard. The existing stations are compromised. Polar data is vital for shipping and for aircraft. You will lead a small team, civilian expertise, military discipline." He could have said no on scientific grounds, could have argued that the war had turned against them, that the ice would not listen to orders. But the map felt like a summons. Dege saw isobars curling like script across the ocean and felt the old yearning of the geographer to write his name in the margin of the unknown. He requested time to assemble equipment and personnel, and the officer allowed a thin smile that held neither warmth nor cruelty, only inevitability. They moved through lists, radios and valves, spare generator brushes, sextants and chronometers, mosquito netting even though there were none at that latitude because supply officers loved completeness, rations packed in tins that pretended to be eternal, medical kits sealed with wax, rifles issued with the apologetic practicality of a desk clerk who had never seen a polar bear. Every item was typed twice and stamped once. When the meeting ended, one of the scientists, a quiet man with nicotine fingers, walked Dege to the stairwell. "The Arctic cures romanticism," he said softly. "It is all measurement there, and patience." He did not say good luck. He said, "Do not trust snow when it looks like stone." Dege returned home across a city that already felt like the afterimage of itself. Streets had open gaps where houses once stood. Trams rang their bells as if sound alone could keep the rails aligned. In the apartment, his wife had folded his shirts into a suitcase as neatly as she arranged the nursery, and their son slept with his cheek pressed to a toy boat carved from a pencil. The smell of soap and stale bread filled the tiny rooms. They ate in silence at the kitchen table. When the child woke and toddled to the doorway, Dege lifted him and felt the weight of a future that might not include fathers. He set the boy down gently and told his wife the outline of his orders, leaving out coordinates and names, leaving out the kind of details that turn worry into terror. She listened without interruption, the way she listened to music she did not like. At the door, she pressed a small object into his gloved palm. It was a pocket watch, old and heavy, the glass slightly scratched, the second hand firm as a march. "It was my father's," she said. "It loses a minute every month. You will correct it when you can. Promise me that you will correct it." He nodded, wondering whether she meant the watch or something larger. Departure began the next morning like a mechanical sunrise. Warehouses, crates, names ticked off a ledger with the finality of fate. His team assembled on a wet pier where gulls complained like bureaucrats. There was Muller, the radio specialist whose patience outlasted storms. There was Schreiber, barely a man, with quick hands and the hopeful eyes of someone who still believed that skill would be rewarded. There was Kranz, the medic, who carried bandages and the secret habit of humming children's songs when he was anxious. Others followed, each with a function and a flaw, each chosen because the Arctic demanded both. The supply ship waited with a cold engine and a practical soul. Cargo was winched aboard in a rhythm of steel and rope. Fuel drums, antenna masts, wooden beams, wire, canvas, the anonymous heft of survival. On deck, the officer in charge of logistics pressed papers into Dege's hand and recited the inventory in a flat tone that turned bread into numbers and lanterns into weights. At the end, he added without sarcasm, "Return your empties, return yourselves if possible." Fog slid in from the river as if to erase the scene before it could become memory. Dege leaned on the rail and listened to the ship's hull speak in low notes to the water. Behind him, the city faded into a smudge. In front of him, the mouth of the sea widened with indifferent grace. He set the pocket watch by the ship's chronometer, subtracting the minute it had lost, honoring his promise as if punctuality could hold back what was coming. For days, the ship pushed north through a grey that refused to end. The world narrowed to deck and sky, and the small dramas of men in confined space. They learned one another's silences. They rehearsed shortwave procedures until words felt like screws you could turn with cold fingers. At night, Dege marked the stars with a sextant and thought about the old navigators whose faith lay in angles, not ideologies. They reached the first ice like the edge of another continent. It was not a wall, but a language, slabs and flows composing grammar with the tide. The ship's bow found the syntax and spoke it loudly. Crewmen stood at the rail as if at the lip of a story they were not sure to enter. The temperature dropped without negotiation. Breath became smoke. Sound lost its echo. Even then, even with the taste of salt freezing at his lips, Dege felt the old lift of purpose. He assembled his men on the foredeck and laid out the plan. Survey the coast. Choose a site with shelter from prevailing winds. Unload in stages. Raise the aerials at once. Secure fuel against drift. Store food where even a hungry bear would find the effort insulting. Weather readings would begin within 24 hours of landfall. Reports would be transmitted twice daily, at fixed times, with backups for failure and discipline for fear. He did not speak about heroism. He did not speak about glory. He spoke about procedures and margins, about lists and labels, about keeping a journal even when the journal kept you. A thin cheer went up that embarrassed everyone and satisfied no one, but it filled the space where doubt had been growing. The ice broke reluctantly for them as they threaded a narrow channel toward the shadow of low mountains glazed with light. Svalbard rose like a rumor that had turned solid. The shoreline offered a shallows of gravel and a slope to higher ground, where the wind curled in mild breakers rather than fists. The captain signaled engines to half, then to a whisper, and the anchor fell with a sound like an argument ending. Boats took them ashore, bouncing in small waves that carried more cold than motion. Boots hit pebbles and sank a little. Knees quivered with the sudden certainty that the earth was once again beneath them and would now hold them to account. They stood and looked in every direction at once, like men in a gallery, trying to see all the paintings at the same time. "Here," Dege said at last, pointing to a shelf of ground above the tide line where snow lay in shallow drifts among black rock. The masts there, the generator hut there, the radio room between, the stores dug in below. "We will build the weather in a place the weather respects." They worked until their breath hurt. Crates became walls, canvas became roof. Wire sang under tension as the aerials rose, thin lines bowing to a sky that had never learned to kneel. The generator coughed, then found its voice. The radio warmed like an animal that had been sleeping too long. Muller tuned the receiver and nodded. "We can hear the world," he said, "if the world remembers how to speak." By evening the station had a shape, a name, and a purpose, modest as a lighthouse of tin in a country made of silence. Dege opened his log and wrote the first entry for this latitude, this longitude, this odd agreement between science and war. He checked the pocket watch again, pleased to find it only half a minute behind the ship's clock, and set it right with the careful pride of a man repairing a ceremony. Night did not come. The sun hovered and circled as if unsure of its own calendar. Men rolled in blankets and discovered that sleep was not an order the body obeyed easily at this latitude. Someone laughed at nothing and stopped before the sound grew sharp. In the radio room, a soft hiss promised that messages would find their way out into the world, and perhaps back again. On the gravel outside, Dege paused before closing the door. The air smelled of salt and iron and a little of fear. He placed his palm on the new wall as if checking the pulse of a patient. It was steady. Inside, on the table, the first weather forms waited for numbers. He thought of the scientist who had told him the Arctic cures romanticism. Standing there, with the wind already filing its complaint against the eaves, Dege felt something that was not romantic but was close to devotion. He went in to begin. The hum of the generator became the rhythm of their days. Its steady vibration pulsed through the metal floorboards, a sound that promised warmth and endurance in a place that tolerated neither. Morning and night meant nothing here. The sun circled endlessly, the same disk of pale gold rising and falling without truly setting. The men began to lose count of time, measuring life not in hours but in tasks. Fuel drums emptied, radios tested, meals rationed, data recorded. Outside, the Arctic was a cathedral built from light and wind. Ice sheets cracked like distant thunder. The mountains glowed with a white so pure it seemed to erase thought. When the wind fell still, the silence was so complete that even their breathing felt intrusive. Dege often walked beyond the camp perimeter, clipboard in hand, pretending to measure snow depth while really listening to the emptiness. It reminded him of old lecture halls before the students arrived, a pause before meaning began. Each day followed the same pattern. At 7, they calibrated thermometers and barometers. At 10, radio checks. At noon, the first transmission of weather data to Norway. At 1600, a second report to Germany. In between, they repaired wires, melted snow for water, and logged the unending sameness of the sky. Muller, the radio operator, developed the habit of speaking to the static as if it were a friend. "Maybe someone listens," he said one morning when Dege entered the hut. "Maybe they answer, and the wind steals it before we hear." Dege smiled without humor. "Then let the wind have its messages. It carries them further than we ever could." The younger men tried to keep spirits alive with jokes, songs, and small rebellions. Schreiber carved his initials into the wooden table and claimed it was for navigation, a personal landmark in a featureless world. Kranz organized a competition to guess the exact temperature at noon. The winner got the last piece of chocolate. Dege let them play, knowing that these games were not foolish but necessary. When the first bear tracks appeared near the stores, they reinforced the perimeter with wire and hung flares. One night, a roar broke through the wind, deep and hollow. By the time they rushed outside, rifles trembling in their hands, the creature was gone, leaving only prints in the snow as large as helmets. Dege stared at them and murmured, "A perfect hunter. He kills only when he must. We kill because we are told." No one answered. The landscape began to change with the advancing season. The sea ice thickened, the air sharpening into glass. Sunlight slid across the surface of the snow, scattering halos that dazzled the eyes. The men learned the hard way that beauty could burn. Their skin cracked, their lips bled, their eyelashes froze together. Yet there was pride in surviving each day. Every successful transmission felt like proof that they still existed. In the evenings, when the generator coughed and dimmed, Dege gathered them inside the radio hut for briefings. He traced pressure systems on maps tacked to the wall, explaining the invisible dance of air and ocean that governed their task. His voice carried authority, but beneath it lay a gentler note, the teacher speaking through the officer. "Observe, record, understand. That is how we fight now," he said. "Our weapon is accuracy." He still wore the pocket watch on a cord inside his parka. Sometimes he checked it against the radio clock, a small ritual of control. It comforted him to think that while nations crumbled, his seconds still moved in perfect order. Late at night he wrote in his journal by lantern light, noting not only weather but impressions. The sound of frost cracking in the roof, the smell of oil and metal, the way isolation made even simple speech feel heavy. He wrote for himself and perhaps for the future, believing that science, unlike war, might be remembered kindly. Then came the first real storm. It began with a shifting tone in the wind, a low moan, like something alive. The barometer dropped sharply. The horizon vanished, replaced by a curtain of grey that swallowed mountains and sea alike. Within minutes, the wind became a solid wall. Snow whipped sideways, hard as sand. The station groaned under the assault. Men ran from hut to hut with ropes tied around their waists so they would not vanish into the white. Dege shouted orders no one could hear, his words shredded by the gale. For 12 hours they fought the storm, securing crates, tightening cables, feeding the generator like priests tending an altar. At dawn the wind broke suddenly, leaving the air so clear it felt unnatural. The camp was half buried. 2 antenna masts had snapped. A storage tent was gone entirely, its contents scattered across the ice. The men looked at the ruin and then at each other. No one spoke until Schreiber whispered, "If Berlin could see us now." Dege forced a smile. Berlin never sees, it only commands. They spent the next 3 days digging, repairing, enduring. The rhythm returned, but something invisible had shifted. The Arctic had tested them and found their weakness. Each man now understood how small they truly were, how fragile the thread that kept them together. Yet, paradoxically, that awareness made them stronger. They began to watch out for one another more closely, sharing tobacco, dividing warmth, speaking less but meaning more. One evening, as twilight brushed the ice with faint color, Dege stepped outside alone. The air was so still he could hear the slow creak of glaciers miles away. He lifted his face to the endless sky, where the first faint shimmer of aurora danced like breath made visible. For a moment he felt both awe and insignificance. The scientist and the man merged into silence. He thought of the phrase his colleague had once used, "The Arctic cures romanticism," and realized it was only half true. The Arctic stripped away lies, but what remained could still be beautiful. Behind him, through the hut window, the radio lamp glowed like a single ember in the snow. He turned back toward it, toward duty, toward the routine that kept madness at bay. Tomorrow, they would measure, report, and survive again. By the time autumn settled over Svalbard, the station had become a machine powered by routine and necessity. Every sound had its place. The click of the barometer, the soft tap of rain on tin, the endless ticking of Dege's pocket watch. The Arctic was no longer a wilderness to them, but an equation to be solved. Each gust of wind another variable in a problem that refused to end. They had built a fragile civilization out of measurements. Dege often reminded his men that accuracy was their defense against despair. "We cannot control the world," he said one morning, as they huddled around the plotting table. "But we can describe it." He said it gently, as if the words might break if he spoke too loudly. His notebooks filled with neat columns of numbers and careful sketches. He drew cross-sections of cloud formations, diagrams of pressure fronts, graphs that looked like heartbeats. Science was his prayer, and precision his faith. Yet the others, less devout in this religion, began to feel the strain of so much order in a world so empty. Schreiber muttered one evening that God must have lost interest in latitudes above 78 degrees north. "Only Dr. Dege still believes in something here," he said, half joking. Kranz, mending a torn glove by lamplight, looked up. "He believes in numbers. They never argue back." Muller grinned at that, but no one laughed long. Each man found his own small ritual. Kranz wrote letters to a wife who would never receive them. Muller polished the radio dials until they shone. Schreiber carved the days into a wooden beam, a primitive calendar that grew faster than he expected. Dege saw these things and said nothing. He understood that science alone could not fill the silence. At night, when the generator was throttled low to save fuel, he stayed awake under the weak glow of the lantern, rereading notes from the first German polar expeditions of the previous century. Those explorers had been heroes to him once, men who chased knowledge into the void and brought back fragments of understanding. Now he saw their names in the margins of forgotten journals and realized they had shared the same illusions, that knowledge could make isolation meaningful, that description could defeat chaos. Outside, the first snow of the long winter fell, dry and whispering. It did not descend so much as accumulate, layering quietly until the shapes of tents and crates blurred. When the sun began its slow retreat below the horizon, the men gathered to watch its final arc. The sky turned crimson, then violet, then the deep iron blue of permanent twilight. No one spoke. When it was gone, it felt like a door closing. The next day began the season of darkness. The change was more than physical. Without light, time lost direction. The men became pale ghosts of themselves, their bodies ruled by clocks rather than the Sunday. The radio's green glow painted their faces like actors trapped in a single scene that would not end. Meals shrank, conversations shortened, tempers frayed. They lived in a perpetual now. Dege tried to keep morale through discipline. He announced daily lectures on geography, small talks on the formation of glaciers, on the behavior of Arctic foxes, on the physics of snow crystals. The men listened politely, their eyes glazed, their minds elsewhere. One evening, as he traced a line on a map to show prevailing currents, Schreiber interrupted. "Sir, with respect, what does it matter? The Reich is collapsing, these numbers, these lectures, who will ever read them?" Dege froze. For a moment he saw the room as Schreiber did, the walls sweating with frost, the paper maps curling, the air thick with diesel fumes. Then he answered quietly, "Someone will. Not today, perhaps not soon. But knowledge survives even when nations do not." Silence followed, broken only by the faint whine of wind through the antenna wires. Later that night, Dege wrote in his diary, "Faith is believing that the act of recording is worth more than the result. But faith, even scientific faith, is fragile." The darkness pressed closer each day, their eyes strained under the dim lamps, their minds wandered. Muller began hearing phantom transmissions, swearing he caught fragments of music between bursts of static. Kranz found him one morning asleep at the radio, murmuring half-words in his dreams. Schreiber stopped marking the days on the beam, saying there was no difference between them anyway. Dege watched them with growing unease. He tried to fight the slow erosion of will by doubling the routines, more measurements, more reports, more structure. Yet sometimes, while writing the daily summary, his own hand hesitated. The numbers blurred. He would blink and find that several minutes had passed without memory of them. In those moments he wondered if the Arctic was not simply a place but a test, designed to see which would break first man or reason. One night, after the others slept, he stepped outside. The sky was a deep vault of moving light. Curtains of green and purple shimmered above, the aurora twisting like thought made visible. He stood there until the cold bit through his coat, until he felt both humbled and exposed. For the first time he whispered a prayer, not to God or the Reich, or even science, but to the vast, indifferent world. "Let me bring them home." He returned to the radio hut, checked the instruments, wound the pocket watch. It ticked with perfect precision. The comfort of its sound almost made him smile. Then he turned down the lamp and wrote the evening report. Temperature -18 degrees, wind calm, visibility nil, morale uncertain. He hesitated before signing his name. The ink froze at the tip of the pen. Outside, the aurora rippled once more, and the darkness deepened. The sun's last arc sank below the horizon on a day that felt like any other. There was no ceremony, no final blaze of color, just a slow dimming of the world until everything sky, snow, and sea merged into one endless shade of gray. From that moment forward, the men of Haudegen lived without day or night, beneath a ceiling of darkness that would not lift for 4 months. Inside the station, their clocks became gods. Every schedule, every heartbeat, every decision revolved around numbers on a dial. 7 in the morning, 12 at noon, 1600 hours, arbitrary coordinates in a sky that no longer existed. Dege forced them to follow the timetable exactly, convinced that structure was the only barrier between sanity and the void. He rang the small brass bell for breakfast. Tin plates clattered, spoons echoed against enamel. The smell of boiled oats mixed with kerosene from the heater. They ate in silence, eyes down, each man's breath visible in the cold air. When someone spoke, it startled the others, as though language itself had gone out of fashion. Beyond the walls, the wind became a living presence. It howled around the corners, whispered through the antenna cables, and sometimes roared so loudly that it seemed to be inside the room with them. At night, it pressed against the tin roof, like an enormous animal trying to break in. The men gave the wind a name, Erica, because it seemed easier to face a monster with a name. Dege continued his scientific notes, though the handwriting grew smaller with each passing week, as if the darkness were shrinking him too. He documented everything: the duration of the storm, the humidity inside the living quarters, the frequency of sleep disturbances among the men. "Observation remains our duty," he wrote. "Even when the world disappears, the record must remain." Muller had stopped shaving. His beard made him look older, almost scholarly, though his eyes betrayed the constant flicker of fatigue. He claimed to hear faint signals through the static, a rhythmic tapping, too regular to be natural. "Someone out there is still transmitting," he said. "Maybe another station." Dege listened once, heard only the hiss of cosmic noise, and said, "It's nothing. The aurora distorts frequencies." But privately he wondered if Muller had caught the heartbeat of the planet itself, or perhaps the echo of their own isolation bouncing back at them. As the darkness deepened, tempers frayed. One night Schreiber accused Kranz of stealing extra rations. Kranz, insulted, struck him across the table, and the two men grappled until Dege intervened. "Enough," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "We will not let hunger make animals of us." The fight ended, but the air remained brittle for days. In his diary that night, Dege wrote, "Discipline must replace sunlight. The light is gone. Therefore, we will become the light." To lift morale, he ordered evening readings from books, salvaged from supply crates, manuals, field guides, even a volume of Goethe that had somehow survived the journey. Schreiber, embarrassed, read aloud by lantern. "Over all the hilltops divided by is calm now." The words trembled in the thin air. No one dared speak afterward, afraid the silence would break. By mid-November, sleep became unreliable. Dreams blurred into waking hours, and the men began to experience brief flashes of light that were not real hallucinations caused by exhaustion and vitamin deficiency. Kranz reported seeing a figure standing outside the window, waving. When they rushed to look, there was nothing but snow moving in the wind. The cold tightened its grip. Diesel thickened. Generators needed constant coaxing. They burned extra fuel to keep the radios alive, even if no one answered. Muller insisted that messages were still being sent from the Reich. "They cannot all have fallen," he said. Dege let him believe it. Hope, even false hope, was better than none. One night, when the temperature dropped to -30, the door blew open in a sudden gust. Snow poured in like smoke. Dege and two men fought to close it, shoving against the invisible force until the latch caught. Afterward, they stood panting in the dark, covered in frost. "It wants us," Schreiber whispered. "The ice wants us back." Dege almost answered, then stopped, because for the first time he thought Schreiber might be right. They began posting watches in pairs. No man was left alone, not even for an hour. The darkness played tricks, voices heard in the static, footsteps on the roof, lights glimpsed across the bay that vanished when approached. The Arctic was teaching them its cruelest lesson, that isolation could become a presence as real as any enemy. One morning, when the wind paused at last, they stepped outside. The world glowed faintly under the aurora, a shifting green veil that rippled across the heavens. The snow reflected the light so that the men themselves seemed luminous, their shadows erased. For a moment all fear receded. Muller whispered, "It's beautiful." Dege nodded. Beauty and indifference often share the same face. The silence that followed was almost sacred. Then the wind returned, and the light faded as quickly as it had come. They walked back to the station, each man wrapped in his own thoughts. That night, Dege wound his pocket watch and listened to its heartbeat. The second hand moved smoothly, as faithful as ever. He thought of his wife's words, "Correct it when you can," and realized that even here, even at the edge of the world, he was still trying to correct time itself. He closed the watch, set it on the table, and blew out the lamp. The darkness remained. By December, the world had narrowed to the size of their station. The darkness outside was no longer something they could push back. It had entered them, seeped into the rhythm of their breath and the tone of their voices. The generator's growl became the pulse of their reality, a reminder that existence was now measured in the hours before the next refueling. The radio hut, once the heart of their connection to the Reich, had turned into a shrine of static. Müller sat before the set for hours, the green light flickering on his face, his headphones pressed tight. Each evening he logged the same message: no contact established. Transmission continues. Dege came to stand behind him one night and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Try again at 0200, he said quietly. "Perhaps atmospheric interference is stronger tonight." Müller adjusted the dials, the room filled with a low hiss that sounded like breathing through ice. Then, faintly, a tone, a fragment of a voice perhaps, or imagination. He turned the knob gently, searching. The tone vanished. "Gone," he murmured. "It was there, I swear it." Dege nodded. "Sometimes the ether plays tricks. Keep listening." They had begun to ration fuel and food more severely. The tins of bread grew lighter. The water barrels were a third frozen. Frost climbed the inner walls like pale vines. The men slept in layers of coats, their breath frosting on the blankets. Kranz counted the remaining medical supplies and found that they had fewer morphine ampoules than cigarettes. Discipline became ritual. Every morning, despite exhaustion, they stood outside for the flag-raising, an old German naval ensign that fluttered weakly in the windless air. "It is important," Dege insisted. "We observe the forms. Civilization is built on forms," Schreiber muttered, "even when civilization is gone." But he raised the flag anyway. In the radio logbook, pages began to fill with silence. The lines between entries grew longer, the ink fainter. On the 12th of December, Müller thought he caught a call sign, 3 dots. A dash, 2 dots, but it dissolved into noise before he could write it down. Dege leaned over his shoulder and read the notation. "It could be a ship," Müller whispered. "It could be anyone. Or it could be no one," Dege said. "Keep it recorded anyway." The Arctic had stolen their sense of distance. Without daylight, without reliable communication, they were trapped in an endless present. The past felt invented, the future theoretical. Dege wrote in his diary, "I begin to understand that time is a form of weather, something that changes depending on pressure and light." One evening the wind dropped completely. The stillness was so deep it made sound itself seem like an intrusion. Dege stepped outside, snow crunching under his boots, and listened to the absence. No surf, no air moving, not even the creak of the aerial wires. The sky above was a field of faint stars, cold and sharp. He found himself whispering, "Is anyone out there?" But the words died before they left his mouth. Back inside, Müller was still at the radio. He had removed the headphones and was staring at the receiver as if waiting for it to speak first. "It's too quiet," he said. "I don't like it." "The weather is stable," Dege replied. "Perhaps the storm belt has moved south." Müller shook his head. "Not the weather. The airwaves. There's a difference." That night, Dege dreamed he was back in Berlin, giving a lecture to an empty hall. The maps behind him showed nothing but blank white space. He woke to find the lamp still burning and his notebook open. He had written a sentence he did not remember. "Silence has a temperature." When the aurora returned a few nights later, its light seemed weaker, more distant. The men stood outside watching it flicker across the sky, green fading to violet, then to black. "It's beautiful," Kranz said softly. Dege answered, "It's a message we cannot read." The next day they attempted another long-range transmission. Müller tapped the key slowly, spelling out the weather report. "To headquarters, to any station receiving this. Coordinates 79 north, 11 east. All systems functioning. Awaiting instructions." He released the key and listened. Seconds passed, then minutes. The receiver remained mute. Finally, Müller tore off his headphones and slammed them onto the table. "They're gone! There is nothing left to hear!" Dege stared at him, the words sinking like stones into his mind. "Then we will continue as ordered," he said after a moment. Müller's face twisted in disbelief. "Ordered by whom? There is no command left." Dege's voice was steady. "There is still order. As long as we keep recording, there is order." He turned back to his logbook, opened to a clean page, and wrote the date in full. His handwriting was precise, almost beautiful. December 15th, 1944. Temperature -22. Sky overcast. No response on any frequency. When he looked up, the others were watching him in silence. In the dim light, their faces looked carved from the same ice that surrounded them. For a long while, no one moved. The generator hummed on, a small heartbeat in an endless void. Later that evening, Schreiber took first watch. He sat by the window, the rifle across his knees, staring into the blackness where sea met sky. After an hour, he whispered to Kranz, "Do you ever think we're the last men alive?" Kranz didn't answer. He simply drew his blanket tighter and listened to the faint, ghostly hum of the radio in the next room, the sound of a universe that had stopped replying. By January, the men had stopped marking the calendar. The dates no longer mattered, only the slow rhythm of survival remained. The Arctic had turned them into creatures of habit and silence. When they spoke, their voices seemed to echo off the walls like sound trapped in a cave. Outside, the snow no longer fell. It drifted sideways, endless, erasing footprints before they were finished. The wind carried fine powder through cracks in the walls, coating everything with a thin white film. Even inside, it snowed. Dege's notes grew more meticulous, almost desperate in their precision. January 4th, 1945. Pressure steady. Visibility 0. Personnel fatigued but operational. He wrote the word operational even when he did not believe it. Writing the lie made it feel real for another day. The storm arrived without warning. A grey morning turned to night in minutes. The wind struck like a solid wall, shaking the huts until nails screamed in the timber. They fought to secure the antenna, ropes snapping like whips. Snow filled every corner, choking the generator's intake. Dege ordered everyone inside the main hut. They sealed the doors with spare canvas, and the world outside ceased to exist. For 2 days they heard nothing but the sound of the storm, a deep, rhythmic pulse that became almost hypnotic. Müller sat by the dead radio, whispering as if it could hear him. Kranz stared at his hands for hours. Schreiber muttered prayers he didn't know he remembered. The walls vibrated, the lamps flickered, and through it all the wind spoke in voices that were not quite human. On the third day, when the storm finally broke, the world looked transformed. The antenna masts were gone, snapped clean. The smaller storage hut lay flattened under a drift of snow. The flagpole had vanished entirely. They stood staring, blinded by the returning light. "It looks different," Kranz said softly. "It looks cleaner," Dege answered. They dug for hours to reach the buried equipment. Frost had made the shovels brittle. One broke in half. Schreiber uncovered a frozen box of rations and laughed hysterically until Dege pulled him back to his senses. That night, as they ate in silence, Schreiber said, "Sometimes I think the snow is watching us, waiting for the right moment." No one replied. The next week, the first hallucinations began. Kranz saw movement outside the window, figures walking across the ice. He ran out with a lantern, calling names that vanished in the wind. When Dege and Müller dragged him back inside, his face was covered in frostbite. "They were waving," he insisted. "I saw them." Müller, who had once been the most rational among them, started keeping 2 sets of logs, one for weather, one for voices. "They come through at night," he explained, showing Dege the pages filled with nonsense words. "Not human frequencies, something else." Dege read the scribbles in silence, then said, "You're overtired. Rest tonight." Müller smiled faintly. "Rest is what they want. That's when they speak." The line between observation and obsession blurred. Even Dege felt it. He would stand outside for long minutes, staring at the endless white, until the horizon began to pulse. The light seemed to breathe slow, steady, alive. Sometimes he imagined that the snow was whispering in Morse code, spelling something he almost understood. In his diary he wrote, "The Arctic is not empty. It is full of mirrors. It reflects what we bring here." Sleep became impossible. Dreams came fast and vivid. Ice breaking underfoot, his son calling from beneath the surface, voices reading his own reports back to him. He would wake with his hands trembling, the pencil still clutched in his fingers. On January 20th, Schreiber disappeared. They found his tracks leading away from the camp, perfectly straight, as if he had been following an invisible path. The trail continued for nearly 2 kilometers before it stopped at a ridge of fractured ice. Beyond it, the sea stretched black and infinite. There was no sign of him. Kranz wanted to search further, but Dege shook his head. "We would die out there too." They stood together at the edge of the ridge. The wind had calmed. The sea was smooth, reflecting the weak shimmer of the aurora. Müller whispered, "He just walked into the horizon." Dege said nothing. He removed his cap and stood bareheaded in the cold. Then he turned back towards the station. "We will record his loss," he said simply. That night they sat around the table with the logbook open. Dege wrote the entry himself. January 20th, 1945. Personnel reduced to 10. Cause, disappearance. Presumed accident during observation. He hesitated, then added one final line. The Arctic takes what it wants. The men read the words in silence. No one contradicted them. Afterward, Dege lay in his bunk, listening to the faint groaning of the ice. He imagined Schreiber still walking out there, forever circling the island, part of the wind now. In a strange way, he envied him. Schreiber had escaped the waiting, the measuring, the endless wait. Before sleep came, Dege whispered to himself, "We must not lose the line." He was not sure whether he meant the radio signal or their fragile connection to reality. Perhaps they were the same thing. Outside, the aurora returned, brighter than before. The sky looked alive with silent fire, green and gold and blue, the colors of a fever. The storm had passed, but the madness had only just begun. For 3 days after Schreiber vanished, the camp existed in a tense quiet that was worse than any storm. Every sound, the pop of the heater, the shifting of ice underfoot, made them turn their heads, half expecting to hear his voice calling from the dark. But the only voices that answered were the wind and the static. Dege insisted they continue with the regular observations. "Routine is survival," he said, though his own voice sounded thinner now, as if hollowed out by the wind. Muller protested once, "Routine for who, sir? There's no one left to receive these reports." But Dege silenced him with a look. The argument dissolved like breath in the cold. The men repaired the damaged antenna and cleared the snow from the collapsed storage hut. Their movements were automatic, stripped of energy, but they worked. The generator stuttered, belching blue smoke. Diesel was running low. Kranz calculated their reserves and reported that they could last another 6 weeks if they reduced heat at night. "We'll sleep in shifts," Dege ordered. "We endure until the thaw." That night the aurora burned so bright it illuminated the snowfields like daylight. The ice glowed faintly blue. Muller refused to sleep. He kept watch at the window, notebook in his lap, recording every flicker of light. When Dege found him hours later, Muller's eyes were red and distant. "He's still out there," he whispered. "Schreiber." The light moves like he's signaling. Dege looked out into the frozen distance. The aurora danced, weaving ribbons across the black sky. "That's the Earth's magnetism," he said softly. "It's not him." Muller didn't look away. Maybe magnetism has learned to speak. The next morning, Dege found a note pinned to the radio table. It was Muller's handwriting, neat but uneven. "If he returns, tell him I heard him calling." Muller was gone. His bunk was empty, his rifle missing. They searched until the wind erased his tracks. Kranz found one glove half buried near the shoreline, the leather stiff with frost. There was no sign of Muller himself. They stood at the water's edge for a long time. The horizon was pure white, indistinguishable from the sea. Dege removed his cap again, the gesture already ritual. "He followed the same path," Kranz murmured. "Do you think he saw something?" "I think he couldn't bear not seeing," Dege answered. When they returned to the hut, the radio was on. The headphones rested on the table, faint static whispering from the speaker. Kranz picked them up, hesitated, then pressed them to his ears. After a moment, his expression changed. "I hear something," he said. "A signal." Dege leaned close. "Describe it." "It's a pulse. A tapping, regular, like someone sending code." Dege took the headphones and listened. At first it was nothing, then, faintly, a pattern. 3 short taps, 2 long. A pause. Then again, SOS. He straightened, the blood draining from his face. "Record it," he said. They logged the time and frequency. For an hour they listened, but the signal never changed, repeating the same desperate rhythm. Finally it faded, leaving only static. Kranz stared at the recorder. "It could be him," he said. "It could be Muller." Dege rubbed his temples. "Or it could be the wind echoing through the wires." That night neither of them slept. DJ sat at his desk, reading Muller's old logs, the pages of indecipherable words, the sketches of waveforms and frequencies. In the margins, Muller had written a single line: "When the world stops speaking, listen harder." Dege closed the notebook and whispered, "I'm still listening." Over the next days, more strange signals appeared. Not voices exactly, but patterns of tone and rhythm, sometimes steady, sometimes erratic. They charted them carefully, convinced that someone, somewhere, was still alive. But the origin was impossible to trace. The signals came and went with the aurora, vanishing whenever the sky was dark. Dege began to spend longer hours at the radio himself. The machine became an altar, its faint hum the only proof that the universe had not abandoned them. Kranz watched him from the doorway, uneasy. "You need rest," he said one evening. Dege shook his head. "I need confirmation." "Of what?" "That we exist." The next storm came silently, a windless snow that fell straight down, filling the air like ash. Dege woke to find the door half blocked by drifts. He stepped outside to clear it and saw faint footprints leading away from the camp, heading north. The snow was falling so heavily that he could not tell how fresh they were. He followed them for a few meters before stopping. The wind had no voice, the sky no color. Everything was white. He turned back, heart pounding. Inside, Kranz was sitting by the stove, hands shaking. "I heard them," he said. "Both of them, Schreiber and Müller. They were calling my name." Dege looked at him. "And did you answer?" "No." Kranz stared into the fire. "I was afraid they'd answer back." They did not speak again that night. The wind picked up, brushing against the walls with soft fingers. The radio flickered with faint static like breathing. Somewhere in the distance, something cracked, ice shifting or something heavier. Dege sat at the table and opened the logbook. He wrote slowly, carefully. January 28th, 1945. Personnel reduced to 8. 2 presumed dead. Distress signal received. Source unknown. He paused before closing the book, then added a final line. The silence has changed its shape. He set down the pen and looked at Kranz, who had fallen asleep in his chair. The stove glowed dimly, casting long shadows across the walls. For the first time, Dege felt that the station itself was breathing, its metal sheets expanding and contracting with the cold, its walls murmuring with trapped air. It was alive in the same way the Arctic was alive, endlessly indifferent, endlessly patient. He whispered into the dark. "We continue tomorrow." Outside, the footprints disappeared under the snow. The Arctic closed its mouth. By the time February gave way to March, the world beyond their frozen island had collapsed. Armies were falling back, cities burning, empires ending. Yet on Svalbard, the men of Haudegen still recorded wind speed, temperature, and cloud cover, as if their words could hold the world together. No new signals came. The mysterious tapping had ceased. The airwaves were empty once more, a silence so complete that it began to feel deliberate, as if the world itself had turned its back. Dege worked longer hours in the radio hut. The light from the lamp gave his face a hollow glow. Kranz watched him from the doorway, uneasy. "You should sleep, sir," he said one evening. Dege didn't look up. "I will, after the next transmission." "What if no one's listening? Then the data will wait for them." They kept sending their weather reports twice a day, as ordered. At 7 in the morning, visibility low, winds from the northeast, pressure falling. At 4 in the afternoon, cloud cover 80%, light snow, -18. Always the same rhythm, always the same silence in return. On March 21st, Kranz entered the radio room holding a small tin of tobacco. "Happy birthday, sir," he said quietly. Dege blinked. "I'd forgotten." Kranz smiled faintly. So had we all. They shared a pipe, the smoke curling against the frozen air. For a few minutes the station felt almost human again, but the moment passed quickly. Outside, the wind moaned through the masts like a choir of ghosts. That evening, Dege decided to attempt a longer-range transmission. He adjusted the frequency to the high band used for naval communication and tapped slowly, carefully. "To any receiving station, this is Haudegen. Coordinates 79 north, 11 east. Weather station active. Request confirmation of contact." Over. He waited. The static crackled, rose, then fell, and then faintly a voice. Not words at first, only fragments of tone. Then, clearer, in English. "This is London. Repeat, Germany, unconditional surrender." Dege froze. "Say again," he whispered. "Repeat the message." The signal wavered. The voice returned, distant, broken by static. "The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered." Then silence. Kranz stared at him. What did it say? Dege removed the headphones slowly. It said nothing important. "Sir, I heard something. It sounded like..." "Static," Dege interrupted. His tone was final. "Continue the duties." But that night, he could not write his report. His hand trembled over the page, pencil hovering above the blank paper. Finally, he wrote only one sentence. A voice said the war is over, but the wind still blows, and we still record it. The next morning, Kranz confronted him. "We should verify it, sir. If it's true..." "If it's true," Dege said quietly, "then it changes nothing. Our orders are to observe until relieved. We have not been relieved." The conversation ended there. Kranz didn't argue again, but his eyes held questions he no longer dared to speak. Days passed. The men grew quieter, their movements slower. The endless dark of winter had given way to a pale, colorless light that revealed everything yet illuminated nothing. The snow had stopped falling. The world was still. On April 2nd, the generator failed. They spent 2 days repairing it, working in silence, hands numb and faces burned by the cold. When it finally roared back to life, the sound felt like a heartbeat returning after death. The next night, a weak signal reached them again, this time in German. A coded message, garbled and faint, but the key words were clear. All forces to cease operations. Hostilities ended. Await further instruction. Kranz grabbed Dege's arm. It's official, the war's over. Dege's eyes stayed fixed on the receiver. We cannot verify the source. It could be enemy propaganda. Sir, you heard it. I heard noise. Until we receive confirmation from command, we proceed as ordered. The argument was sharp, bitter. Kranz slammed his hand against the table. Command doesn't exist anymore. Dege's reply was calm, almost cold. Then we represent it. He ended the discussion by turning off the radio. That night, Kranz sat by the stove staring at the flames. He's lost in his own discipline, he whispered to one of the others. He thinks obedience can save him. Dege, alone in his room, opened the logbook. April 3rd, 1945. Transmission received. Authenticity uncertain. Operations continue. Then beneath it, smaller handwriting. If this is peace, why does the wind sound the same? Spring began to return in slow, deceptive ways. The sun climbed a little higher each day. The snow softened. Ice broke from the cliffs with the low groan of thunder. The men took turns standing outside just to feel the warmth of light on their faces. But even the light felt foreign now. Too bright, too fragile. Dege spent longer hours alone, rereading the diaries of polar explorers. Their calm precision comforted him, their belief that knowledge could order chaos. One night he wrote, "Faith is a habit. I can no longer tell if mine is courage or madness." On May 8th, at precisely 1600 hours, the anniversary of their arrival, Dege performed the daily transmission. The message was identical to all the others. When he finished, he switched off the transmitter, sat back, and stared at the blank wall. The room seemed smaller than ever. Kranz interred quietly. "Sir, it's May 8th. I know. In Europe, they're celebrating peace." Dege turned to him. "Then let them. Here, we still have work to do." He picked up the pocket watch and wound it slowly. The ticking filled the silence. Then he said, almost to himself, "If the world has stopped fighting, we must keep it alive by remembering how." Kranz said nothing. He simply watched the man who could not let go. Outside, the wind moved gently across the snowfields. The flag they had once raised was now torn to ribbons, fluttering weakly against the mast. The war had ended everywhere except here. May turned to June without ceremony. The snow softened, water trickled beneath the ice, and seabirds returned to the cliffs, their cries echoing through the long Arctic twilight. But inside the weather station, time remained frozen. The men moved through their routines as if following a script no one dared to rewrite. Every morning, the flag still went up, what was left of it. The red cloth hung in tatters, its edges frayed by wind and months of exposure. When the light hit it just right, it looked almost translucent, more ghost than banner. Kranz sometimes stared at it for long moments, unsure whether he felt pride or pity. They called themselves the last outpost of the Reich. Half in jest, half in defense of sanity. The words carried a bitter humor. Even Dege smiled once when Müller's replacement, a quiet technician named Voss, said, "We're the capital now. The rest of Germany is just a rumor." But beneath the laughter was a slow corrosion of spirit. The world had ended elsewhere, yet they continued to behave as though they were still part of something vast and orderly. Reports were written, data filed, weather transmitted into the void. Dege demanded precision in every detail, the ink neat, the handwriting clear, the language exact. He inspected each entry personally. "History will remember the accuracy," he said one evening. "Whose history?" Kranz asked quietly. Dege looked up from his notebook. "Ours." No one answered. That night, as they ate their meager rations, the men began to talk about home. Voss said he dreamed of his wife standing at a railway station, holding a letter that never came. Kranz spoke of the smell of pine trees after rain, the one memory that never left him. Even Dege allowed himself a rare confession. "When I was a boy," he said, "I thought maps were alive, that the lines on them breathed, and that every explorer added new veins to the body of the world. Now I see they were just boundaries drawn by men who needed to believe they understood something infinite." The silence that followed was heavier than the walls around them. A few days later, a supply crate washed ashore driftwood, rope, and a single rusted fuel drum. There were no markings. Dege inspected it as if it were a message from another world. "The ocean still remembers us," he said. Kranz shook his head. "Or it's returning what we've lost." The rhythm of their existence continued. Wake, measure, transmit, repair. endure. Yet the reports had become absurd weather observations for a nation that no longer existed, numbers typed into a machine that no one heard. Still, they persisted. Dege began holding brief ceremonies in the evenings. They gathered in the radio hut, reciting the log entries aloud like scripture. Each man read his section. Then Dege concluded with the same phrase, "Observation complete, station operational." It became a ritual of survival, an incantation against meaninglessness, but the strain showed. Kranz started to cough blood. He refused to rest. "If I stop working," he said, "the world stops with me." Voss's hands trembled whenever he touched the transmitter, though he claimed it was only from the cold. One morning, a thin mist rose from the thawing sea. It blurred the horizon, turning the water and the sky into the same endless grey. From the shore, the station looked like a toy left behind by a forgotten child. Dege stood watching the fog and whispered, "We're ghosts now, sending messages to the living." That evening, Kranz confronted him again. "Sir, we have to stop. We're not serving anyone anymore. The Reich is gone, the war is over, and the world has moved on. Let us go home." Dege's expression was calm, but something in his eyes flickered. "Home," he repeated. "Home is discipline. Without it, we are nothing." Kranz slammed his fist on the table. "We're already nothing." For a moment, Dege said nothing. Then he stood, the old authority returning to his posture. "If you wish to leave, you may, but you will not take my command with you. The station will remain operational until relieved." No one moved. They all knew there was nowhere to go. The ice still barred the sea, the nearest settlement hundreds of kilometers away. They were prisoners of geography and faith. That night, Dege walked alone to the antenna field. The air smelled of salt and meltwater. He touched one of the masts, feeling the cold hum of the wind through the metal. Above him, the aurora shimmered faintly, its light fractured by the mist. He closed his eyes. In the hum of the cables, he almost thought he heard voices, the ones who had vanished, the ones he had led. They were not accusing him, only reminding him. "We are the weather you measured." When he opened his eyes, tears had frozen on his lashes. Back in the radio hut, he sat at the transmitter and began to type, not the weather, but words. "To any station receiving this, we continue our work. We remain loyal to duty and to knowledge. We await orders, though none may come. We serve the idea that observation is survival." He sent the message twice, then sat back. The static replied softly, like a breath through the cables. The next morning, Kranz found him still at the desk, asleep with the headphones around his neck. The logbook lay open before him, the last entry half finished. June 12th, 1945. Temperature steady. Empire concluded. Observation continues. Kranz read the words and closed the book. He whispered to himself, "The Empire is snow." July arrived like a whisper. The snow retreated in streaks, unveiling the grey bones of the island. Streams of meltwater cut fragile paths through the gravel, flowing quietly toward the still frozen sea. The light returned, pale and endless. It should have felt like deliverance, but for the men of Haudegen, it only revealed how small they had become. Their world was unraveling slowly. The generator sputtered and died twice in 1 week. The last barrel of diesel was half empty. The antenna cables sagged, the insulation cracking from months of cold. Food rations were reduced to scraps, a few tins of bread, powdered soup, and dried meat that tasted of iron. They rationed words now too. Each sentence had to earn its right to exist. Kranz was thin and hollow-eyed, his cough worse. The others took turns tending to him, but Dege no longer seemed to notice the illness. He spent most of his hours at the table, rewriting reports no one would ever read, as if neatness itself could undo decay. His handwriting remained precise, even as his fingers trembled. On the morning of July 8th, the generator failed for good. The sudden silence was immense, absolute. The men looked at one another as if the world had stopped breathing. Dege rose slowly from his chair, went to the window, and stared at the motionless antenna field. "It seems," he said softly, "that the observation is complete." No one replied. They worked the rest of the day, dismantling what they could. The batteries were salvaged, the remaining fuel poured into small lamps. When night came, not true night, just a dimming of the endless daylight, they sat around the cold stove. For the first time in months, they heard only natural sound. The crack of ice, the cry of seabirds, the beating of their own hearts. Kranz spoke first. "What do we do now?" Dege looked at him. "We wait." "For what?" "For relief." Kranz shook his head. "No one's coming." "Then we wait for the idea of relief," Dege said. The words were strange, but he meant them. To stop waiting would be to admit that the world had ended. 2 days later, Dege began writing what he called the final report. He used the last of the ink, his sentences deliberate and slow. July 10th, 1945, weather stable, equipment failing, personnel exhausted, observation terminated by necessity. He paused, then added in smaller script, science requires closure. Faith demands continuation. We have chosen silence as our final entry. When he finished, he closed the logbook and placed it carefully inside a sealed tin box. If we are never found, he said, let this be our monument. That night, Kranz couldn't sleep. He sat near the doorway, listening to the faint rustle of meltwater outside. Finally, he spoke into the darkness. Sir, do you still believe this means something? Dege didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was calm, almost gentle. Meaning is not given to us. We make it, and then we protect it until it breaks. Kranz nodded slowly. And when it breaks, then we record that too. The next morning, they held a small ceremony without words. The tin box was buried under a cairn of stones near the antenna mast. Each man placed one rock with his own hands. Dege placed the last and stood for a moment, eyes closed, as if listening for a sound beneath the wind. Then he saluted, a slow, weary gesture that belonged to another time. Afterward, they dismantled part of the station to conserve what remained. The radio mast was lowered and laid across the ground, its wires coiled like veins. The flagpole, long bare, was cut into pieces for firewood. For the first time, the camp looked honest. Not a station, not an empire, only a handful of men in a ruin waiting for the world to notice them again. That evening, the horizon flickered with a strange light. Far to the south, beyond the ice, a faint orange glow shimmered against the clouds. The men stared, confused. Lightning, Kranz asked. No, Dege said. His voice was almost reverent. Cities burn like that. He turned away before the others could see his face. Later, while the others slept, he sat alone at the table and opened his wife's pocket watch. The second hand still moved, smooth and precise. He listened to its rhythm and realized it was no longer marking time, it was counting distance, measuring the space between the world he remembered and the one that remained. He closed it carefully and set it beside the sealed tin. Then he whispered, "End of observation." The words hung in the air, final and absolute. Outside, the wind changed direction. The Arctic breathed again, indifferent and eternal. After the burial of the logbook, time loosened its grip completely. Days no longer had edges. They drifted together like the melting flows outside their camp. The light never changed. It was always the same pale wash over a world that refused to end. The station had become a hollow shell, a monument to exhaustion. The men no longer rose at fixed hours. They woke when they woke, ate when hunger reminded them, and spoke only when silence grew unbearable. Dege still kept his watch wound and set it beside his bunk each night, though he no longer believed the ticking meant anything. It was simply a sound that proved the world had not yet stopped. Kranz grew weaker. His cough came in violent fits that left blood on the snow. He hid it as best he could, but the others knew. Voss stayed close to him, fetching water, mending his clothes. Sometimes they sat outside together, watching the fog curl over the bay. "You ever think we'll be found?" Voss asked one afternoon. Kranz laughed softly. "Everything that's lost gets found eventually, even ghosts." Inside, Dege began building a signal fire, a pile of driftwood soaked in the last of their fuel. It would burn for only a few hours, but it was something to aim for, a gesture toward being seen. Each evening, he added a few more pieces of wood, measuring the pile as carefully as he once measured pressure systems. "Visibility is the last form of existence," he told Voss when the younger man asked why. "Visibility to who? To whatever passes by." The waiting became their new experiment. They tested endurance, measured faith. Each morning, Dege walked the perimeter, noting the patterns of thaw, the shifting cracks in the ice, the direction of the wind. His notes were shorter now, the language pared down to bare observation. Sky white, ice thinning, no sound today. One evening, a low groan echoed across the bay, a deep, resonant sound that rolled through the air like a memory. The men rushed outside, scanning the horizon. A long, dark shape was moving slowly through the mist. For a heartbeat, it looked like a ship. "Rescue!" Voss shouted, waving his arms. Dege raised his field glasses. The shape wavered, distorted by fog. Then, as the mist shifted, it vanished entirely. There had been nothing there, only an iceberg collapsing in the distance. Voss lowered his hands. Kranz sank to his knees, coughing, the sound swallowed by the wind. Dege turned back toward the camp. "We will light the signal tomorrow," he said. His voice was calm, but his face had gone pale. They spent the night preparing. The pile of wood stood like an altar at the edge of the ridge. When morning came, a grey, endless morning, they lit it. The flames rose quickly, the heat startling after months of cold. The smoke twisted upward, black against the washed-out sky. For a moment, it looked magnificent, their presence drawn in fire upon the blank page of the Arctic. "Someone will see it," Voss said. "Perhaps," Dege answered. "Perhaps that's not the point." They watched until the last ember died. The air smelled of burned oil and hope. Nothing appeared on the horizon. No sound of engines, no voices. Only the quiet return of wind, sweeping the ashes flat. That evening, Kranz could not rise from his bunk. Dege sat beside him, reading softly from the old weather logs. The words had become strange prayers. Pressure steady. Wind from the south. Temperature -12. Kranz smiled faintly. "You make it sound like scripture." "It is," Dege said. "It describes a world that once existed." Kranz's eyes closed, the rhythm of his breath shallow. "If they ever find us," he whispered, "tell them we stayed until the end." "They'll know," Dege said. Kranz exhaled one last time and did not inhale again. Dege sat beside him for a long while. The others watched from the doorway, unsure whether to speak. When he finally stood, he said only, "We will bury him at dawn." They laid Kranz in a shallow grave near the cairn that held the logbook. The ground was softening, and water pooled in the hollows. Dege placed a piece of driftwood at the head as a marker and carved one word into it: observer. That afternoon, the sky cleared completely for the first time in months. The horizon stretched unbroken in every direction. The world felt impossibly wide, and they felt impossibly small. Dege climbed to the highest ridge, scanning with his field glasses. Nothing moved. No sails, no aircraft, no hint of humanity. He stood there for hours, the wind pulling at his coat. When he returned to the station, he found Voss sitting by the silent radio, headphones around his neck, eyes closed. "I'm still listening," Voss said without opening them. "To what?" "To the quiet. It's starting to sound different." That night, Dege recorded his final entry. July 21st, 1945. Personnel reduced to 7. Fuel exhausted. 1 deceased. Station awaiting relief. Observation terminated. Hope remains uncertain. He paused, then wrote one more line beneath it. "We are waiting for something we can no longer define." He set down the pen, closed the book, and sat in the silence. The wind outside rose and fell, a soft breathing that might have been the world itself. It happened on a day so clear it seemed unreal. August 4th, 1945. The air was sharp and dry, the sky an endless blue bowl. The sea, free now of ice, shimmered like metal. The surviving men of Haudegen were outside, repairing what little remained of the antenna structure when they heard the sound. At first, they thought it was thunder, a low, rolling vibration across the horizon. But thunder had no rhythm, and this sound did it pulsed. Engines. Voss shaded his eyes. "Sir? Aircraft?" Dege looked up. Far to the south, a small dark shape cut across the pale sky. It moved steadily, growing larger. "No," he murmured, "not aircraft. A ship." They stood in silence, watching the black speck rise from the horizon, cresting the curve of the sea like a slow revelation. It took nearly an hour before they could make out its form, a small naval vessel, grey against grey, flying a red, white and blue flag. Voss dropped his tools. "Norwegian," he breathed. For the first time in months, the wind seemed to stop. Dege didn't move. His face was unreadable. "Signal them," he said at last. "We'll need to surrender properly." The words felt strange in his mouth, as if they belonged to another language. They raised a white cloth on the last standing mast. It was not a flag, just an undershirt tied to a pole. The ship drew closer, cautious, its engines echoing through the still air. Through binoculars, Dege could see men on the deck, uniforms neat, rifles slung casually. One of them waved. Voss whispered, "They found us." Dege corrected him softly. "No, we have been found." When the ship finally anchored near the shore, a small boat detached and began to row toward them, 4 men in naval grey, armed but relaxed. The splash of oars sounded impossibly loud. Dege straightened his uniform jacket. It was worn. The insignia faded, but he brushed the dust from the collar and buttoned it with care. He took the tin box containing the logbook from its cairn and tucked it under his arm. "Gentlemen," he said to his men, "stand straight. We will greet them as soldiers." The Norwegians approached, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. One of them, tall and fair-haired, called out in English, "You are the Germans." Dege stepped forward. "I am Lieutenant Wilhelm Dege, commanding officer of Weather Station Haudegen. We are prepared to surrender." The Norwegian officer hesitated, then nodded. "You know the war is over." Dege's answer was calm. "We suspected." There was an awkward silence. The Norwegians exchanged glances, unsure whether to salute, to laugh, or to pity. Finally, the officer extended his hand. "Welcome back to the world." Dege looked at the hand for a moment, then shook it. The gesture felt heavy, ceremonial. Behind him, Voss lowered his eyes, unable to speak. The Norwegians began inspecting the station, walking among the collapsed huts and rusted barrels. They spoke quietly to each other in a language the Germans couldn't follow. One pointed toward the cairn. Dege said, "One of ours, buried there." The Norwegian officer nodded and removed his cap briefly. By afternoon, the small boat had returned to the ship with a radio message. An hour later, they came back with supplies, food, coffee, tobacco, medicine. The smell of real coffee nearly broke the men. Voss wept openly. That evening, the two groups sat together outside the ruined station. The Norwegians shared their rations. The Germans offered their last biscuits in return. The sea was calm, the sun low but never setting. For the first time in over a year, there was laughter, hesitant, fragile but real. One of the Norwegian sailors asked, "Why did you stay so long? Didn't you know it was finished?" Dege took a long breath. "We had orders," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "and perhaps we needed them." The sailor frowned slightly but said nothing more. Later, when the Norwegians slept aboard their boat, Dege walked alone along the shore. The sea lapped softly against the rocks. The flag they had raised, a torn white cloth, still fluttered weakly in the wind. He watched it for a while, then lowered it and folded it carefully, as if it was something sacred. In his diary he wrote, August 4th, 1945. Contact established. Norwegians arrived at 1700 hours. We have surrendered our position without resistance. Station Haudegen ceases operations. Observation complete. He paused, then added one final note. The Arctic keeps its own kind of peace. It is colder, but perhaps purer. The next morning, they boarded the Norwegian vessel. As the shoreline receded, Dege stood at the rail, the wind in his face, and watched the station shrink to a smudge on the horizon. For a moment, he felt both immense relief and unbearable loss. Voss came to stand beside him. "Sir," he said softly, "what will we tell them?" Dege looked at the disappearing island. "We'll tell them the truth," he said, "that we were here, that we listened, that we waited longer than anyone should have to." Behind them, the ship's engines roared, carrying them south toward a world that had moved on without them. The ice closed slowly over the wake, erasing their path as if they had never been there at all. The journey south took 6 days. The sea was calm, the sky a faded blue, and yet for the men of Haudegen, the world felt unbearably loud. Every sound, the thrum of engines, the clang of metal, even laughter from the Norwegian sailors, seemed to pierce a part of them that had forgotten how to hear. For months they had lived in a place where silence had weight and meaning. Now, surrounded by noise, that silence felt almost sacred, something they had lost forever. Dege stood on deck most of the time, coat buttoned, watching the horizon recede behind them. He seldom spoke. When Voss asked what he was thinking, he said only, "About what happens to men when they're no longer needed." They passed through fields of broken ice, then open sea, then the green coastline of Norway. Villages appeared, real villages, with smoke, movement, color. The smell of pine drifted across the water, strange and almost painful in its familiarity. When they finally docked, the Norwegians greeted them kindly but formally. There was paperwork, questioning, procedures. The war was officially over, but bureaucracy was eternal. The Germans were no longer enemies. They were curiosity's men who had outlasted a world. Reporters came. Cameras flashed. Someone said they would be the last German soldiers to surrender in Europe. The phrase spread quickly, repeated in several languages. To Dege, it felt absurd. "We surrendered months ago," he muttered. Only the world noticed late. They were taken to a small camp near Tromsø for debriefing. The Norwegians were respectful. They provided clean uniforms, hot food, medical care. Yet the men moved like ghosts through their new surroundings. Even warmth felt foreign. Kranz's empty bunk haunted the room like a missing heartbeat. At night, Dege lay awake listening to the hum of electric lights. He found no comfort in their brightness. The darkness of the Arctic had been purer, more honest. Here, everything flickered, uncertain. He began writing again, not reports this time, but recollections. His notebook filled with fragments. Silence as command. Wind as companion, observation as belief. One day, a Norwegian officer visited him. The man was polite, curious. "You kept recording weather until the very end?" "Yes," Dege said, "even when you knew it no longer mattered." Dege looked at him. "Especially then." The officer nodded slowly, not understanding but respecting the conviction. Before leaving, he said, "You must be relieved it's over." Dege smiled faintly. Over is only a word. In late August, they were transferred to Oslo for repatriation. Crowds gathered at the port to see them, these strange remnants of a vanished empire. Children pointed. Some adults applauded ironically. Others simply stared. Voss whispered, "They look at us as if we stepped out of a story." Dege replied, "Perhaps we did." When they boarded the transport ship bound for Germany, Dege turned back for one last look at Norway's mountains, sharp and blue against the sky. He thought of the Arctic winds still sweeping over the cairn and the buried tin box. He wondered if anyone would ever find it, open it, and understand the kind of faith it represented, the faith of men who measured weather for a world already gone. Back in Germany, they were processed, questioned, and dismissed. The Reich no longer existed, and neither did the army that had sent them north. They were civilians now, men without a uniform or a purpose. Dege returned to his hometown in Thuringia, a quiet place untouched by fame or memory. He took work at a school, teaching geography. His students liked him. He spoke softly, drew maps with care, and told stories about ice and wind without ever mentioning war. Sometimes, on clear evenings, he would walk outside and face north, eyes tracing the invisible line towards Svalbard. He could almost hear the generator's hum, the tap of the radio key, the whisper of snow against the walls. He kept the pocket watch on his desk. It still ticked, though faintly. Each sound carried the memory of that other world, a world of discipline, silence and frost. In 1950, he was invited to write an official account of the Haudegen expedition. He accepted, though he called it a chronicle of endurance, not glory. In the opening line he wrote, "We were sent to measure the weather, and found instead the shape of solitude." The book was modestly received. Scientists praised its precision. Historians admired its restraint, but few understood the weight beneath its calm surface. Years later, when asked if he regretted staying so long, Dege answered, "Regret is for those who believed there was a choice." In the years that followed, the world changed again, new wars, new borders, new empires pretending to permanence. But in every map Dege drew, he always included a tiny island in the Arctic, marked only with a small cross. He never labeled it. When his students asked what it was, he would smile and say, "Just a place where people once listened very carefully." The sound of silence stayed with him all his life. The years moved quietly, like snowfall settling over old tracks. By the time the world had changed again, new flags, new nations, new wars, Wilhelm Dege had grown into an old man with kind eyes and steady hands. He lived simply, surrounded by maps, his desk always neat. Yet the Arctic never truly left him. It waited, like a pulse under the ice, silent but alive. In the winter of 1963, a young journalist visited him, eager to write about the last German weather station of the war. Dege received him politely. The man's questions were many, about hardship, about discipline, about what it felt like to be the final soldiers to surrender. Dege answered each question carefully but briefly. When the journalist asked what he remembered most, Dege hesitated, then said, "The sound." "The sound?" "Yes, the sound of nothing. When the radio stopped and the world went quiet. You don't forget that kind of silence. It's not emptiness. It's a presence that watches you." The young man didn't understand, not fully, but he wrote it down, and later, in his article, he described Dege as a man who measured the weather and found eternity. After the journalist left, Dege opened the old tin box he had kept on his shelf. Inside lay a few yellowed pages, copies of the log entries he had rewritten after returning home. The handwriting was still precise, still careful. He traced the words with his finger and whispered, "Observation complete." That night he dreamed of Svalbard again, the grey huts half buried in snow, the generator humming faintly, the aurora rippling across the sky like breath. He saw Kranz laughing, Müller listening to the radio, Schreiber walking toward the horizon. None of them looked afraid. They were simply part of the landscape, now figures of wind and frost. When he awoke, dawn was breaking over the village. The snow outside his window glowed pale blue, like the light of the Arctic. He felt strangely peaceful. Dege died that spring, in his sleep, at the age of 64. On his desk lay a small note, written in the same steady script as always. "For my son, Eckhart." If you ever hear the wind from the north, listen. It carries the voices of those who watched the weather long after the world stopped listening back. His son, who would later become a polar researcher himself, found the note and understood. Years later, Eckhart organized an expedition to Svalbard. In 1967, he and a small Norwegian team located the ruins of the Haudegen station. The huts were collapsed, the antenna field reduced to twisted wire, but the cairn still stood. Beneath the stones they found the tin box, perfectly preserved by the cold. Inside was the original logbook, its pages dry and legible. The final entry read exactly as his father had written it. August 4th, 1945. Contact established. Observation complete. Eckhart held the book in his gloved hands for a long time. Around him stretched the same silence his father had described, vast, watchful, alive. He whispered, "I hear you." They left the cairn intact, placing the box back where it had been found. Above it, they set a small plaque in Norwegian and German. Here stood Weather Station Haudegen, 1944, 1945. The last German outpost of the Second World War. Their duty ended, but their silence endures. When Eckhart returned home, he placed his father's pocket watch beside his own instruments. It still ticked faintly, as if counting not time but distance. Years passed. The Arctic remained unchanged, its storms, its stillness, its indifference. Yet somewhere under that endless snow, the remnants of Haudegen endured, rusted metal, frozen ink, the faint echo of a radio signal sent into a sky that never replied. And perhaps, if one listens carefully enough, when the wind shifts over Nordaustlandet and the night glows with the ghost light of the aurora, one might still hear it, a pulse, a whisper, a message. This is Haudegen. Observation continues.